If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, well, aging. Perhaps you have heard that for older adults, it's simply too late to build muscle. On the Aging Well podcast, we believe otherwise, and that resistance training becomes more important the older we get. In this episode, we discuss a research study that concludes that 12 weeks of progressive, whole-body resistance exercise training can effectively increase quadriceps cross-sectional area, whole body and appendicular lean mass, upper and lower body muscle strength, and improve functional performance in both 65 to 75 years and 85 plus years older men and women. Thus, weight training can benefit us even when we start late in life.
A fan of Aging Well podcast shared an article from the Washington Post titled, "It's Never Too Late to Lift Weights. Older Bodies Can Still Build Muscles." And I think that this is a great topic to discuss. What do you think?
This is a great topic. The article refers to several research studies, so let's look at them as well. You have trained several older adults. What is the oldest you had someone lifting weights?
I would say the oldest I've had someone lifting weights is 98 years old. But we were using really, really lightweight at that point. For resistance training, not actual weights, but just kind of getting up and down, was actually 102. So that's the oldest person that I've ever trained.
Nice. But what's this lifting lightweight?
The lifting light weights, so it started off from like 2 to 3 pounds, and then it kind of made its way all the way to 12 pounds. But just, I don't know, we dropped it back down to 8, and 8 was a good, healthy range where they could get a full range of motion, good technique, good form without throwing their whole body. So they were controlled and steady with that 8-pound range.
So is that light, or is that just a higher intensity for them that was just light relative to us?
Yeah, you know what? I guess it would be light relatively for us, but it was a good resistance that's a good way to look at it.
I think it's important for us to understand that, light weights for some are not necessarily light. That's the right way to phrase it, because we tend to think of lifting heavy being really, really big weights. But for somebody who is young and really strong, 100 pounds isn't a lot. But for somebody who is in their 80s or beyond, 100 pounds will crush them. And so we have to think in terms of relative intensity as opposed to the number that's on the dumbbell or on the barbell. And so, so as one of my students, you probably recall me talking about Harry, a personal training client I worked with at the Jewish Community Center in Pittsburgh many, many years ago.
Oh yeah, Harry, was the 84-year-old who had never lifted weights before.
He was, and he had come to me after reading a tough study that had come out. It was a pretty kind of cutting edge study at the time, where they looked at resistance training in nursing home patients and found that regular resistance training, again, general guidelines resistance training, enabled a significant number of those older individuals to have less reliance on their assisted devices, canes and walkers and so on. And he walked with a cane, and he was determined he was going to not have to use the cane anymore. And so for his 84th birthday, he gifted himself with a personal trainer and started working with me. And I got to work with him for about 3 months.
Very cool. So is it safe to say that you agree with the Washington Post article?
I do. Sometimes I actually do agree with articles we find in the popular press. So for the listener, what does the Washington Post say about lifting weights for aging well?
The author opens with the statement, contrary to popular wisdom among many gym goers and even some scientists, healthy people in their 60s, 70s, and beyond can safely start lifting weights and rapidly build substantial muscle mass, strength, and mobility. She then reports that a new study of resistance exercise in the elderly found that even people in their 80s and 90s who hadn't weight trained before showed significant gains after starting a supervised program of lifting weights 3 times a week.
And that study was muscle mass and strength gains following resistance exercise training in older adults 65 to 77 years and older adults above 85 years by Gabriel Nasri Marsuka Nasser and colleagues, published in October 2023 in the International Journal of Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. Let's give the listeners a little background on the study.
The study included 29 healthy participants, 17 older adults, 65, 75 years, and 65 to 75 years, and 12 older adults above 85 years in Chile.
It is worth noting, too, that they were all relatively healthy weights. The older 65 to 75 had an average BMI of 26.9 kilograms per meter squared, and the older 85 plus had a BMI of 26 kilograms per meter squared.
All volunteers performed 12 weeks of supervised whole body resistance exercise training 3 times per week. Before and after 6 and 12 weeks of training, a computed tomography scan of the upper leg and lumbar spine vertebrae L3 region was performed to assess quadriceps and L3 muscle cross-section area. Fasting blood samples were obtained to determine biochemical and inflammatory markers, and a whole body dual energy X-ray absorptometry scan was performed to determine lean and fat mass. Maximal strength was determined by the 1 rep maximum, RM. Physical performance by the time up and go test, the short physical performance battery, and health-related quality of life by the 36-item short-form survey, the Lawton and Brody Instrument Activity of Daily Living Skill at the same time points.
So the participants were relatively healthy, and the research design seems pretty good. So what was the exercise intervention program like?
Supervised whole body resistance exercise training was performed 3 times per week during the 12-week exercise training intervention. Training consists of a 5-minute warm-up on the cycle ergometer and global upper limb movement, flexion, extension, and abduction, adduction of the shoulders, followed by 1 warm-up and 4 regular sets on both the leg press and the leg extension machine. Upper body exercises included the chest press, lat pull down, and horizontal row performed with 2 sets of each exercise. Each exercise session ended with a 5-minute cool down through global muscle stretching exercises. During the first 6 weeks of training, the workload was increased from 60% to 80% of the 1 rep max, 10 repetitions in each set. Thereafter, 1 rep max was reassessed to adjust workloads 60% to 80% over the next 6 weeks.
And the participants were instructed to maintain their normal dietary and physical activity habits.
They were. 3-day dietary intake records and physical activity records were kept before and at the end of the intervention to corroborate no major changes in the diet or habitual physical activities had taken place. Other than that, there was no dietary control around each individual exercise session or throughout the study.
And the researchers collected blood samples?
Yes. Fasting blood samples were collected to determine serum glucose, triglycerides, total cholesterol, high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, ultrasensitive C reactive protein, insulin, interleukin 4, 6, 10, 13, 15, and tumor necrosis factor alpha concentration. The research also calculated insulin sensitivity.
And what did the researchers find?
The researchers concluded that the 12 weeks of progressive whole body resistance exercise training effectively increases quadriceps cross-sectional area, whole body and appendicular lean mass, and upper and lower body muscle strength, and improves functional performance on the time up and go test, and short physical performance battery in both 65 to 75 years and 85 plus year old men and women. Importantly, no differences in the beneficial effects of prolonged exercise training were observed between the older 65 to 75 and the older 85 plus men and women.
So we aren't doomed to sarcopenia as we age.
Apparently, we aren't. I mean, based off of the information on here, it, and it kind of goes hand in glove of what we preach about. If you're doing resistance training, doesn't matter what age, it really has a significant benefit on the body and whole, especially as we hit that that older age bracket, or the third or fourth age realm that we like to call it. So why is it then that people assume that the old is old can't make the massive gains?
Well, the author suggests that this idea took hold partly because the oldest old so rarely were studied. Past weight training research often capped volunteers' ages at about 75 because of worries that the older people would be unable to handle the training or that their muscles wouldn't respond if they could manage to lift. I think we've just made poor assumptions about aging. I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging.
After 3 months, the participants over 85 were reported to have packed on more strength and mass in relative terms than the younger group, adding the average of 11% to muscle mass and 46% to strength versus 10% more muscle mass and 38% more strength among the younger volunteers.
Yes, and the researchers suggest that this was due in part to them having had an extra decade of declining muscle size and strength compared to the younger lifters. That is, they started from a lower baseline.
So there is hope for aging well, even if we get a late start.
It would seem so.
Any recommendation for the late starters?
Well, first off, don't delay. I would also add, don't be afraid to lift heavy. Increase your protein intake. Take your creatine and maybe consider a daily serving of branched-chain amino acids.
Do you think another factor that takes place with this study, but it's not reflected in the study, is perhaps that older group of volunteers, they added more muscle mass because in their past, in their youth, they were involved in a lot more physical labor or sports or resistance training or working on the farm or whatever the case may be. So they had that base foundation in the beginning, and then due to whatever sedentary lifestyle, atrophy started to occur. And so by getting back into the swing of resistance training, even at a later age, they're able to pack on that strength as described in the article a lot faster than the younger group.
It's possible. And we did the podcast toward the end of last season talking about quote unquote old man strength, which I really hate. And that is a possibility. I don't think there was anything really examined within the study that might tease that out. So it's kind of hard to make any claims regarding that. And the samples are not tremendously large. I mean, we're talking really 29 total people. I know it's very hard to find a group of people in that age group willing to participate in the study and be healthy enough to participate. And so you're kind of limited in a little bit of the generalizability with the study, but I would think that regardless of whether they have an experience in the past of having lifted weights or not, this is still a pretty significant study in terms of demonstrating that people well into their 80s can add muscle mass. And yeah, it might be that prior experience might have kind of stored up some of those myonuclei that we've talked about in previous podcasts that can give us a little bit more of that muscle memory. But, we're talking probably, I would assume from just the way the older population generally is, that we're talking probably over 30 to 40 years of a sedentary lifestyle, not having lifted weights. These aren't people who maybe quit in their 70s and then 10 years back, 10 years later, they're coming back and starting to lift again. So I think it's possible that some of it could just be from the fact that they have early prior experience, but I still think it's very significant for people over the age of 60 to understand that whether you have lifted in the past or not, now is a time to go ahead and start lifting weights.
Do you think another factor for the higher percentage of muscle mass and strength gains in that older demographic also ties in with nutrition? I feel like perhaps in their youth, they had less preservatives into their food and they had more grass-fed meat versus what we get nowadays, where there's no doubt there's a lot more hormones or pesticides that are sprayed on food or added to food to make it better. We have a lot more genetically modified food. I still can't believe that a lot of watermelon here doesn't have seeds in it. That just is so mind-blowing to me.
Okay, that's totally
irrelevant.
A right angle tangent there with the watermelon. I don't understand where you're going with the idea of, their diets from years ago impacting their ability to put on muscle mass.
Well, I mean, from years ago, especially when they're in their youth and their body's transitioning, they're going through the changes. They're a teenager. They're developing muscle mass. They're going through this hormone change. The food that you intake is going to massively affect the hormones that you have throughout your body, right? And with the hormones throughout the body, that's also going to affect muscle gain. Am I wrong?
I mean, honestly, that's not my area. I've not studied kind of the long-term, and I don't think anybody has, because how can you have studied what effect a lack of food processing has had on individuals, basically 70 years down the road. There's no way to do a study like that. I mean, you'd have to outlive your participants pretty long. And I don't know of any academic who's going to be willing to put in 70 years waiting to have a publication on a study. It doesn't seem plausible to me that would be a reason why the 85 plus year olds were able to put on more muscle than the 75-year-olds. I think the conclusion that Marzuka Nasser and his colleagues came up with is probably the most reasonable conclusion, that they just simply had more years to atrophy, and so they had more to actually gain back. So,
yeah, I mean, the only reason why I kind of bring that up is I was just having this discussion with a few of my friends and stuff, and the subject of that elder generation, or our grandparents, or even our great grandparents generation. It's almost as if you look at those old photos of them when they were 18, 19, or 24, 25, and you look at our generation, which was in that same age bracket, it to us, it almost it looks like it's a completely different species of human. I feel like the muscle tone, the bone density back in the day was significantly different than where it's at now. And we were just thinking, perhaps it has to do with the food. Perhaps it has to do with a lifestyle decision. There's so many factors that could go into place, but I don't know. It appeared to be a huge dramatic change. And, there was a group of us talking about this. So it wasn't just like, oh, you guys are over exaggerating. It's no, every single person had the same opinion of looking at older images of their grandparents when their grandparents were, super young and in their youth, and then looking at our group of friends when we were in that same age bracket. Now, when we were in that same bracket, we were physically active. We were involved in sports and training, but it's almost like not even a fair comparison, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but again, you have to look at a lot of different variables to really make the conclusions there. And I think there is a point to be made that if you look at, like my parents, maybe your grandparents, pictures of them in their younger years, they look much more fit, much more healthy than people today of those ages. But I don't think it has to do as much with the level of processed food. And I certainly don't think it has anything to do with genetic modification of food, because in fact, the genetic modification of food has actually made food more accessible. So you could look at the accessibility to nutrition. And if we think that we have better accessibility to food now, we don't. But they had, actually we do. We have better access to food. Teenagers now are theoretically much better fed than the older population because they have more access to food. It's just they tend to choose to eat more crap. They're not as active, even though we might participate in sport. We're not likely as active physically as they were, those who are now 85, because back then they did more physical work. There was less leisure devices and things like that. I mean, they walked, they didn't drive everywhere. I mean, now kids don't even walk to a bus stop, So I think there was probably a healthier lifestyle back then. There wasn't as much focus on exercise. It was more just doing more physical labor. So I think in many ways, you're kind of beginning to compare apples and oranges, and it's hard to make some of those comparisons without really breaking down what exactly are we looking at. And I think that may or may not have a factor to do with how the 85-year-olds were able to gain more muscle mass. You have to recall that there are females in the study. Those females gained muscle mass. Females were not active as much back then. And so, the difference between, somebody who was raised in the 50s versus the 60s, where they're teenagers in the 50s versus 60s is really what we're looking at. I don't think it's hugely that different as it might be if you start comparing, people raised in, my generation kind of being raised more, becoming teenagers in the 70s versus the 80s, 90s, and then on in the 2000s. I think you might see a much more progressive difference in those populations as you compare like your generation to my generation. But in this population, I don't think there's going to be hugely different lifestyles from when they were teenagers. And that much of that difference is going to be coming then from the fact that they just had more time to be sedentary.
No, and that brings up a good point, because there's no denying that with this particular study that you can put on muscle mass at any age, really.
Right. And that's the main thing to look at. It's, could it be different in another 40 years with the population will be 85 then? Maybe. My guess is going to be that unless we make some dramatic changes in our society, it's going to be worse for those 85-year-olds. And, we might be trending more toward Wally World from the movie Wall-E. I don't know. I mean, it's really going to be interesting to see what goes on forward. But the key is that if you're older now, don't let the fact that you are 75, 85, or older deter you from starting a resistance training program. So what are your thoughts on the 12-week program used in the Marzuka-Nasser et al. Study?
4 working sets of leg press and leg extensions and 2 sets of chest press, lat pull downs, and horizontal rows?
Yes.
What was the rep scheme?
10 repetitions per set.
Kind of sounds like our 5x5 program.
No, it doesn't.
No.
5x5 is 5 sets of 5 repetitions.
Okay.
This was 4 sets, looking at leg presses of 10 sets or 10 repetitions, and then upper body was just 2 sets of 10 repetitions.
Obviously, but what I meant to say was it seems like the exercises that they're using are the same as what we discuss all the time.
Yes and no. I mean, they're doing leg presses and leg extensions. They're doing chest press, lat pull downs, and horizontal rows. So yeah, upper body, chest press, vertical pull, horizontal pull, more or less kind of fits into part of that kind of basic 5 that we talk about. Leg press and leg extension is pretty quadricep heavy, and it's definitely not moving through space. It's on a machine. And I think I can understand why they focused more on machines, because you do have a much older population. But it does always concerns me that they don't do hamstring exercises in a lot of these studies, and that it was entirely a machine-based program. It also kind of strikes me, why 4 sets of lower body, but only 2 sets of the upper body?
Well, I mean, 4 sets of 10 is kind of what they teach us, is almost the standard for that hypertrophy group. Reps of 10, 8 to 10, right around there. That's for hypertrophy. So perhaps they were going to gain muscle mass.
Well, I mean, that was the point of the study, was to gain muscle mass. And I understand the kind of 10 repetitions per set. I think it's a fairly reasonable number. They didn't go overly high. They weren't having to do like 15 repetitions in each set. So, I mean, they were doing a much lighter weight. So 10 was probably a pretty optimal number for those sets, especially to develop hypertrophy, especially in an older population. The intensities were 60 to 80% kind of progressive overload. I thought that was a pretty reasonable approach for an older population. They didn't go super light. And, I think it was probably a reasonable level of intensity for the individuals. Volume, I think the exercises ideally would be a little bit different, but, again, you're looking at what are the circumstances of the equipment that they had available, the population that they were dealing with. And so leg presses, leg extensions, probably fairly reasonable. Chest press, lat pull downs, horizontal rows, I think pretty good combination in there. No need to do shoulder presses because, again, you don't want to tear up the shoulders necessarily of the older population. So what else? What do you think about the overall 12-week program that they did?
Well, I agree with you. I think it's interesting that they didn't incorporate hamstrings. And I feel like that age group, hamstring and glutes, would be a critical thing that you'd want to strengthen, especially with getting up or down from a seated position or just overall balance and stability. I get the focus on the quads. It's more easily access to in stationary machines, but there's no denying the benefits of hamstring and glute training.
Well, the glutes are getting from the leg press. In fact, I tend to think sometimes the leg press is a little bit too heavy on the glutes for a lot of people and not as great, certainly for the hamstrings, but also for the quadriceps, although you can get pretty heavy quadricep growth in that. But it seemed like, I don't know, I think it was just more of a convenience type of thing, why they did the exercises that they did. They might have gotten a little bit better hypertrophy if they had focused a little bit more on the hamstrings as well, because now you're working, more muscles than just simply the quadriceps. And they were looking at quadriceps cross-sectional area, not really focused on the glutes. So getting the hamstrings in there would also get that total thickness of the leg improved a little bit more. But overall, I think it was a really reasonable study. We could talk more probably in terms of what we might do differently in a practical setting in order to optimize hypertrophy for older individuals. But overall, I think it was a pretty good study.
The author of the Washington Post article stated, perhaps most important, the older men and women who joined the study were healthy for their ages with few glaring physical limitations. It may be unrealistic for some older people with serious illness or disabilities to begin lifting. Do you agree?
That quote, it may be unrealistic for some older people with serious illnesses and disabilities to begin lifting. I think there may be some challenges, but I don't think it is entirely unrealistic. Remember, can't never did anything.
Can't never did. I missed that quote. I see what they're saying on physical limitations, like being a challenge, but you can also modify exercises as well. And you don't have to go in and start doing a squat right away. You can come up, even if you're in a wheelchair, you can come up. If you're in an assisted living scenario or an independent living, a lot of the hallways have little handrails specifically for individuals that just need that extra help with mobility or stability. You can wheel your wheelchair right up to that handrail. You can hold on to it and you can help assist yourself up, or you can have someone, a loved one, a family friend, or a personal trainer help assist you stand up, and then you slowly guide yourself back down into that chair. So is it considered a squat? Well, technically no, but it's...
No, technically it is. So they did the timed up and go test, which is essentially your ability to stand up. So you're not lowering yourself in the squat, but you were actually doing the concentric portion of the squat and getting up and then moving. So they were mobile. They were able to do that. What they didn't do is focus on the lowering portion of the timed up and go. And there are other tests. I remember when I was at Toledo, one of the kinesiotherapy faculty were working on a test for kind of just a sit to stand, but repeated repetitions of that. So basically kind of a repeated squatting motion for an older population. So with modifying the exercise, I mean, I don't think you have to necessarily worry about somebody in a wheelchair pulling themselves up or anything like that. We can modify any exercise. And so when we look at this idea and statement that it may be unrealistic for some older people with serious illnesses and disabilities to begin lifting, to me, again, we've just demonstrated that people well into their 85 years and above can benefit from resistance training. But then we feed back into that ageist statement that, yeah, but maybe because they're older and their abilities are limited, maybe they shouldn't be lifting weights. It's like bullshit. It's like, how do we adapt the exercise now so that everybody at any age can benefit from the resistance training? Because it is all the same. As we were talking at the beginning of the episode, light weights, what is lightweight to us as a trainer may not necessarily be light to that individual. So if somebody can, with assistance, stand and sit, and that's their squatting exercise, they're overloading their muscle group. Eventually, with enough training, they're going to get to where they're doing that without assistance. And then as they do it without assistance, you add a little bit of weight to it, they get stronger, and they can continue. And so what this study tells me is no matter what your illness or your disability, we can modify the exercise and you can get some benefit from it. Now, there may be, some serious illnesses where it's contraindicating to begin lifting weights, but it doesn't mean that the older person in general cannot begin lifting weights at any age.
Well, in resistance bands, that was primarily one of the tools that we would use in the activities program. Not only would we use free weights, but for a lot of individuals that either had a hard time gripping the free weights or holding on to it, the resistance bands were a huge primary tool that we used. And eventually, once they got that base foundation of strength, then we transitioned into the actual free weights themselves.
And you never actually even have to lift a weight. I mean, resistance training is what we're really talking about here. We tend to say weight training, but really it's resistance training. And there are bands that go in pretty high capacity that I would wager the bet that would be sufficient for even the strongest of the older old. And so they might never actually have to lift a weight or use a machine. We can do it through other means of resistance against the weight. I mean, I've trained in the past with just manual resistance, no weights at all, just somebody pushing against my limb. You could do the same thing with the older population. And so I think it's important that we address the statement that they made in the conclusion of the article. And I don't think it was in the actual research study. I think it came directly from the Washington Post article. And I think it was either a comment from the author of the article or one of the researchers. I don't think it is a good statement to make because it can still give people that out for, well, I'm too sick, I'm too frail, I'm too disabled to begin lifting, so this doesn't apply to me. It does apply to everybody and anybody that wants to age well.
So no matter our age, with appropriate consideration for our current health and fitness, it is never too late to start lifting weights. You are never too old to start
aging well. Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.